Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing games, game design, hobbies, project planning, world buildings, and all... What's a world building? What is a world building?
Now I'm
is
just
that an arcology? Like a whole... Is that like a... Do we make one of those on the first podcast?
I feel like we may have, but it could also be like an office building full of filing cabinets, like a la, shoot, I'm blanking on the movie. Bruce Almighty.
Bruce Almighty.
Yeah, just full of filing cabinets that have all of Earth's history in it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a world building.
That's a world building.
Let's start over.
Okay. Do over. Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
And this is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing, game design, hobbies, project planning, world building, and all things creativity.
So today we're continuing our discussion about D&D and our feelings about D&D.
Keep in mind, these are our feelings, and we are narrativist gamers. If you want to hear more about the distinction between like categories and stuff, go back to our previous podcast, which would be number 3, where we specifically talk more about the design of D&D. But yes, we are coming at this from the narrativist perspective. And as we discussed last time, D&D is definitely a gamist style role-playing game.
This time we're going to talk about mechanics and how the mechanics aren't structured well for a narrativist style game. And also our other concerns about mechanics that are outside of a narrativist game perspective as well. There are some things that we just feel don't work quite well, whether you're looking at this from a narrativist or a gamist perspective.
We might also touch on the problems that we have as single role playing, as in pair role playing, whatever you want to call that, 1-on-1, 1v1 me, IRL Liz in D&D.
Yeah, well, and maybe we should start out with that.
Yeah.
We do a lot of one-on-one role playing, where we have stories that we want to tell that are very specific to one or the other person. We don't intend to have multiple people involved in them. So one of us will be the GM and the other one will be the player. Some of this is born out of the fact that for a while we lived quite a far distance away from our role-playing gaming friends before things like Roll20 and stuff like that existed. And we had trouble finding groups in the areas that we were at that we really wanted to game with. So we got really comfortable running games for each other.
We don't want to get into the entire podcast about one-on-one role-playing now. We've got a separate one planned for that in the future, but suffice it to say that it doesn't work D&D itself does not work very well for that kind of role-playing because it's just not designed that way. Yeah.
But it's important to mention that because that is another perspective of ours that we are bringing to this, is that we do a lot of one-on-one role-playing. And so a lot of our kind of lens of how we look at games is based around that. Now, we have played a lot of D&D with groups as well, and we find a lot of these same problems with groups. It's actually exacerbated by one-on-one role-playing a lot.
Right. Okay, so I think the first thing on our list is a phrase that I don't think is an idea, rather, that I don't think we hear very much at all. I don't think I've ever heard anybody else in the kind of D&D review and critique and game design space talk about, which is rules as adversary. And this is kind of a hard, if you're not used to thinking about game design in terms of game design theory, then this might be kind of difficult to grasp initially. But the idea is that there are situations in which the D&D rules themselves are the challenge, as opposed to things in the rules like a monster or a skill check or a situation that you have to attempt to overcome. Sometimes the rules themselves are the problem, are the thing that you're trying to solve. And there are a couple of, I can think of a couple of concrete examples of this. One is the idea of what we call theorycrafting a D&D character, where you build a D&D character purely for the sake of trying to build that character, generally as like an optimization problem. How do I make the best rogue, the best paladin or whatever? That is exactly rules as adversary. That is you're not really playing D&D anymore. You're playing a meta game against D&D as the opponent, right? Which is, it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but that's definitely an example of that situation.
Yeah, and just think about how many videos there are out there on YouTube about like the best spells for your, rogue, arcane trickster rogue, the best spells for your warlock, how to optimize and really tweak and get the most utility out of the options that you might have for your character.
Right, how to manipulate the action economy in your favor and all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
And there are videos like that, and there's content like that for the GM on the GM side too, of like how to make. I mean, there are entire bloggers whose entire blogging career has been about how to optimize, your combat encounters to threaten the players harder. Right. I'm thinking of the monsters know what they're doing. Right, is like an example of kind of trying to highly optimize your scenarios. Right. I guess I have a complex relationship with this one because, like, on one hand, I am personally the kind of person who can get into a D&D character deep enough to enjoy theory crafting and enjoy the optimization problem. I also know a lot of people who are very much not in that category.
And that would be me. I don't like to do all that theory crafting. I just have an idea of a character I want to play and then wander through the books getting lost. I actually had actually one of the first games that Joe ran for me that I dropped out of because the other players were spending so much time trying to figure out like what's the best optimized character for this situation. And I'm like, I just want to play a character that I like and I'm having fun with this. And my character became really quickly ineffective because I wasn't doing all the rest of that stuff, and I wasn't into that. So
and this was in 3.5, and we had a party of at least two good micromanagers and one capable micromanager, one capable min-maxer. So it was a hardcore party. That group of players could probably have easily dealt with any kind of nominal challenge that I could have fielded at them in the context of that game at that time, right? But that's, I totally get it. There are definitely times when I don't want to do that work, and there are definitely times where that's not the thing that I want to focus on, right? Like we talk a lot about there being character concepts that you can't accomplish in D&D. And sometimes you spend a bunch of time, even when you enjoy that aspect of crafting the character and honing the rules of that character, there are times when you come to realize that the character that you've built like is completely different from the one that you imagine in your head and has like nothing to do with the way you intended to play the character. Yeah.
And from a gamer's perspective, this isn't as big of a problem because that's really what being a gamist, it's part of what being a gamist is about. But from a narrativist perspective, that's getting in the way of the story, that you're spending that much time trying to figure out what's the best character for the game. Right. Doesn't quite match up with like, what's the best character for the story that I want to tell and I want to be participating in. Right. So.
Yeah, I would think, I think that a gamist would actually call that a strength because they consider, and I think this seems to be kind of a truism of the D&D world, is that people who like D&D for what it is enjoy that aspect of it and really like the fact that D&D is kind of the most expansive and complicated and crunchy game, because there aren't any other games that have the same breadth of powers, right? D&D is founded on this kind of synergy ideal, right? Where you're spending all your time as a character designer trying to make the most synergistic character out of all the bits and bobs and pieces and components. And no other game has the amount of bits and bobs and pieces and components as D&D. So I think that puts it firmly, another vote in favor of putting D&D firmly in the category, in the gamist bucket, and saying it's almost, and we talked about we're going to get a lot of flame war action on the last one. This is another good flame bait statement to make, but you almost have to consider D&D more of like more on the board game end of tabletop role-playing games than on the narrative storytelling end of tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it does really well for being like as a gamist game and that side of things. Fantastic. But if you're coming into it from a narrativist perspective and you don't like having to do that crunch, that's a lot to wade through.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about that last time about how D&D is a really hard game. It's just a really complicated thing.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. I don't want to spend, a huge amount of time trying to make my character. I want to make my character and get into the story.
Right.
And so different perspective.
Right. Well, and I think our next point actually sort of contradicts some of what we've agreed that D&D is good at, to be honest.
Yeah.
Fight me 1v1 again here. Cody's video on Taking 20 talked about how in Pathfinder 2 he found that a lot of characters were a lot of players were very uncreative with their characters' actions because they were kind of forced into an optimal path. I would go a step further and say D&D and traditional games that have this kind of structure are all built that way. There will be an optimal path because you have fundamentally said, we're going to label a bunch of these, say, take feats, right? We're going to say all feats are worth 1 feat, but they're definitely, the design philosophy is not that all feats should actually be the same value because there are just some feats that are going to be obviously better than other feats.
Yeah.
So there will necessarily be an optimal path through that problem, right? Like there will be a best feat and a worst feat because you have not said we're going to make them all effectively the same. So that necessarily, again, leads to this kind of repetitive combat activity problem that Cody brought up in Pathfinder, even in like the best versions of D&D.
Yeah, definitely. And we've certainly felt that in the D&D games we've played where there's a bunch of other things that you could potentially do in combat, but it's easiest just to keep using Eldritch Blast,
Right.
If you're a warlock, like nothing else is going to be worthwhile.
Or my like heavy multi-attack combo as a barbarian. There are very few times when it's advantageous not to do the most effective combination that I can do as a character because like, and I guess maybe this is a bit of a knock against D&D's tactical presumptions is that there, especially in our Strahd game, and to I think a slightly lesser extent in our Margren game, there weren't that many situations where you needed to do something that was not just shoot and kill the other guy, right? Yeah. I can think of the time we fought and I don't think this is really spoilerific for Strahd, but if you're really concerned about Strahd spoilers, then skip this next couple of moments here. The time when the vampire spawn guy or whatever was freaking out and we were trying to figure out how to deal with that situation.
Oh, yeah.
I remember there being a lot of maneuvering and trying to be in 2 places at once in that particular encounter. And that was like one of the only examples that I could think of where it was like, I was not using my primary combo as a barbarian. I was like moving around and trying to do multiple things at the same time.
Yeah. But those were the exceptions rather than the rule.
Right.
In a lot of cases.
And that actually reminds me of an interesting concrete case in Strahd. We played in a Curse of Strahd game. I was a barbarian. My job was to beat the crap out of stuff. That's what barbarians do. Somehow, because I was also a paladin, I ended up with a staff that had the ability to turn vampires. And this was towards the endish of the game. And I remember the GM and even the other players to an extent kind of egging me on to try the staff. And I was thinking to myself the entire time, like, so the staff might, it was an optimization problem. I was looking at it in terms of what the action economy was. Like, I can spend my action to try to prevent the enemy from taking his action, or I can try to pile all the damage that I possibly can on that guy and end the fight sooner instead of dragging the fight out longer, right? Like those kind of holding action things are always basically a losing strategy because you're just making it take longer to kill somebody. Like if the goal is to get that guy knocked out, do that sooner, right? Like that's what you want to do. And I feel like it's kind of naive to look at this situation in D&D and think, well, you know, you've got lots of things that you can do. So these kind of optimization things are only the province of like optimization focused players, min-maxers, right? I disagree with that because I think that D&D is designed to encourage the min-maxing behavior. I think it's built around that.
Yeah, I am not an optimization player, and I've found myself doing that in every D&D game that we've run. Like, what's the best choice? You know, what's going to end this fight the quickest it possibly can end?
Right, and I think that sometimes that's even antithetical to the role-playing process because you will frequently find yourself making choices from the point of view of the player as opposed to the character.
Yeah.
Just because that's the optimal strategy, and though your character might disagree and say like, well, you know, maybe Margaret would prefer to do this thing rather than shoot more people with Eldritch Blast constantly.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a pretty good example because I think Margaret was a character who initially at least was not big on her warlock powers.
No, yeah. And just so everybody knows, Margaret's a character from a game that Joe and I ran. Joe ran for me, and I was actually playing both Margaret, the main character, and all of the other characters. So I had like 4 or 5 character sheets in front of me at all times. But
you were operating them in combat, but I was running them as NPCs when they were doing social things.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was one of those cases where Margaret as a character became more focused on her warlock powers over time because it was necessary. It was necessary for you to utilize those powers in order to just succeed.
Yeah.
And I can get that, but that was not the way that we wanted to role play it, and that's just sort of the way the rules made it happen. And we weren't aware enough of it at the time for that to be a conscious choice.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that I would like for it to be a conscious choice about the way the story is going to unfold.
And I know that I've had times in role playing in D&D where I've said, realistically, my character would go over and help my injured party member. But as a player, I know that it's actually going to be more expedient for me to just keep hitting the bad guy and end this fight.
Absolutely.
And that other player can just deal with their stuff because me going over there and doing that is actually going to prolong the fight and make it worse. So I've gone against what my character would do in order to just end the fight because I knew as a player that would be more expedient.
Right.
Which is really metagamey to me.
It really is. And I think part of that is possibly just an instance problem of the way the rules are implemented for death in 5th edition. Yeah. Granted, like in previous editions, you could just freaking die. Like you could just get killed. But in 5th edition, I've heard people complain about like it's too easy to not die. It's so easy to just, not fail at combat and stuff. And it's like, well, I mean, kind of true, but I also feel like it seems somewhat unrealistic for somebody to bleed out in 6 seconds. Like if somebody's been knocked unconscious, and they're not like, they don't have like a gaping wound or something, right? Then they're liable to just kind of lay there for a good while. And so, yeah, there's weird cul-de-sacs of optimization questions that you have to ask yourself as a player when you're at the table and you're sitting there and you're trying to say, I'm the barbarian. I have no healing items. I'm going to have to spend like my entire turn moving to this person and trying to find their healing items and apply them to that person. Yeah. Thus negating any value that I have towards finishing the fight, in the opportunity, giving the GM the opportunity to take that person out again and cause bigger problem. It seems sensical that if somebody's knocked out and it takes an extra 12 seconds to finish a fight, that's not the 12 seconds that's gonna kill that person, right? When it can. Yeah. because they've had to roll their death save. Oops, they rolled a double, they rolled a 1, so now they've lost their death save twice and they're done.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, they went from like, I'm unconscious and bleeding to I'm just straight up dead, like in a couple of seconds.
Yep.
And okay, to circle around some wider questions about this, where we talk about, because I can kind of see an argument for, I can kind of see an argument against that kind of behavior as being like, well, D&D or the combat isn't the only thing that you do in D&D. And to that, I kind of say, sure, but it always comes back down to combat. D&D, I think when we were planning this podcast, I think the phrase might makes right came up, and it kind of really makes a lot of sense for the way that D&D operates. You kind of when everything else fails, it comes down to a fight. It's never like a battle fails and it comes down to a negotiation. How many times has that ever happened? Compare that to how frequently has somebody's negotiation failed, or somebody's stealth check failed, or somebody's diplomacy failed, and now it's knives out.
Yeah, and one of the other things we were talking about while we were planning this was, there's a lot of social situations where, yeah, you could try to roll diplomacy or, deceive or something like that, but it's easier, it's less risky just to fight it out, because you're more liable to win or get through it better than, rolling a deceive check and having your entire success or failure hang on that one die roll.
And even when you do attempt to diffuse a situation with one of these single die rolls, and we'll come back to like how that's not super awesome in a second, but like when that happens, what's the recourse? When you fail your diplomacy check, it always recourses to combat.
Yeah.
Unless there's some crazy situation where you've already been bereft your weapons and you're completely like at the mercy of the opponent, and the only way that you succeed is to make a success on your diplomacy check.
Yeah.
Like those are such weird edge cases that I can't remember any examples of those in the probably 20 years of D&D that I've done.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things is, when you look at the player's handbook and how much of the player's handbook is devoted to combat, you choose your class based on what your fighting style is. You're not like, I'm going to be a diplomat who can also stab people. No.
It's telling that in the older versions there were non-player character classes, NPC classes for things like aristocrat and expert and craftsman and stuff like that. Like those did used to be real classes. They were just classes for people who weren't the player characters. Yeah.
And now, like, it's so geared around fighting that you might as well just fight out whatever you're going to do. Just go, Murderhobo your way through the town. You'll get what you need. Don't worry about it.
And, I mean, we're being a little bit harsh here, but, like, that's what the game is built around, and it's really, really hard to argue that point. Yeah. I mean, that's not an easy thing to defend, I think, is that D&D is based around combat. I don't think anybody's really going to, like, rationally try to say otherwise than that. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we're saying is, that means you need to realize that, and realize that means that things like trying to make a diplomacy check to solve a situation are Hail Marys. They're not, they may fail, and if they do fail, you do default to combat. That's just generally how it happens. Very few parties are going to like surrender and be like, okay, well, you're right. Take us in. I just can't even I can't even imagine a party like you would have to have such good role players that are like really, really devoted to their characters for that to actually ever happen.
Yeah. And so I think this comes back to the fact that, D&D is a good system for a group who wants to be in a lot of combat situations. If
that's what it's for.
That's what it's for. And if that's not the story you want to tell, then it's not the right system. And, that's not the type of stories that we want to tell or we want to take part in all the time. We're not here to murder everybody. We'd actually like to, go explore some ruins or go check out this weird mystery in this other place or something like that, rather than just murder.
Right. And I think D&D also kind of limits the context of violent battles and stuff too, in a way that makes it hard to kind of utilize it in. It has a really specific niche, right? Like it has a really it is a refined, well-oiled Ferrari of dungeon delving. That's what it is. It's a dungeon machine, right? It's in the title. It's not about like having multiple characters who disagree with one another and how they deal with those disagreements. It's not about like interpersonal relationships between people who are powerful and have the ability to whoop one another's ass. Those aren't really what it's for, because you're not like not even the encounter system is set up to deal with those kind of situations very easily. You have to do a lot of legwork and manual data entry to figure out like what is the actual balance between a character of one level versus a single character of another level. If you're talking about PCs, that's just not really part of how it's designed to. I mean, I say it's not designed to do that. What I mean is, sure, you can calculate that, but that's like an addendum, right? It's a separate context of having to do those calculations.
Yeah.
So yeah, what it comes down to is that whenever anything else fails, D&D always comes back to combat, and you just need to know that that's what you're into, right? Like that's the context that it is. So that might not be the right context for you.
Right. Yeah.
Or for us, I guess, since this is about us and our opinions, lest you think that we're trying to convince you of something like don't buy a D&D. No, I don't want you to not buy D&D. I want you to buy whatever you want. I just want you to know what kind of game you want to play and know that it might not be D&D. Maybe it should be something else.
Yeah. And if like you like gamist games, you want to spend a bunch of time figuring out what's the best character balance for the situation you're in, you want to get into a sort of game where you're going to be fighting a lot, D&D is great.
Right.
Buy D&D, get it, play it, enjoy it.
Run it.
Yeah.
We need more DMs. We just hope that some of the stuff that we're bringing up in the mechanics section here, which is going to be probably the most salient set of points for gamist players playing D&D, that some of these points are valuable to you. And on our next point, we have I think it's actually even on the TV tropes list of linear fighters, quadratic wizards. The idea that, generally speaking, physical combat characters tend to have like a linear progression of power, and that magic wielding characters tend to have a much, much steeper, sloping, more exponential kind of growth curve. Like the fighter might kind of be stronger in the middle range, but they're going to just not even hardly hold a candle to what the spellcaster can do at the upper end.
Especially when a spellcaster gets area of effect spells and can nuke the entire
or crazy control spells or like wish. Like how could there be a thing that a fighter can do that is as valuable to the group as wish?
Yeah. Or knock or
right. Like there are a lot of instances where it's like, I guess the problem seems like wizards get to do it both. They can be optimized for combat while at the same time having better utility abilities than the fighter. And then like what? Then you've kind of relegated the fighter to the bullet sponge.
Yeah, totally.
Then you should have called it defender and not fighter, right? Because you've kind of mislabeled. You might be playing something you don't realize you want to not be playing.
Yeah.
In defense of 4th edition, when I first read it, I kind of understood that was the objective that they were trying to mitigate, is that in 3.5 that was strong. that was hardcore strong. Like yeah, at upper levels, like a fighter was like could really tank a lot of stuff and could like really whoop some ass, but the wizard was like, bro, I'm a god over here, you know, like what's the matter with you? And fourth edition, it seemed like was very much about rebalancing that system, that dynamic, because now everybody has the same number of powers and similar structures for how their progressions work. And then people hated it because it wasn't like D&D, right? I think if they had repackaged that as possibly a flame war inducing World of Warcraft RPG, then I think they probably would have been more successful at that.
That would have been a fantastic World of Warcraft RPG. Right. Like, that would have been amazing.
I would almost just play that. Like, just get the 4th edition books out, read some WoW lore, and be like, okay, let's do a WoW game for no reason other than to like give some action to 4th edition. Yeah, so I think they knew that they had a problem, and they took it too far, and then the reaction to their reaction is, well, we'll go back to the old way of probably mostly linear fighters, quadratic wizards.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's as much of a problem these days, but I haven't read enough of the upper level rules and done like theory crafting builds of these kind of characters that I would be able to confidently say that is or is not a problem anymore. What we're saying is that it has been a problem in the past, and it's likely to still be a problem just because of the way the game is built.
Yep. And we'll talk more about upper level fighters and stuff like that in the next episode, because we've got some feelings about that too.
Yep.
So the last thing that we really wanted to talk about here is running a game in D&D. And some of this is skewed specifically towards 5th edition. Some of this is, for all of D&D, but it's tough to be a GM.
It's hard.
It's really hard.
You've got a lot. I mean, as any game master, you've got a lot on your plate. You have a large volume of stuff to deal with. Not the least of which, especially for people like us who have like some social anxiety going on, it is very difficult to sit down at the table and say, okay, I'm cool, I'm chill, we're going to have a good time, nothing's going to explode, people are not going to throw popcorn at each other or pizza, and everything's going to be cool.
Yeah.
Then you have to deal with like juggling combat, juggling all the NPCs in the world, and like now we've got some of these new problems like that people expect you to be like role-playing in character all the time, and all these other all the normal intricacies of running a game, of like building a plot, keeping track of what's going on, keeping track of where the NPCs are, keeping track of what the bad guys are up to, running combat, and then also running combat and planning combat.
Yeah.
That I think is one of the big things that has just always been a nightmare in D&D land. Is there's always been an entire separate subsystem for picking bad guys to fight. And that, to me, has always been a humongous pain in the ass, because I really just want to be able to look at a chart or look at a book and say, okay, I'm going to get 2 of these guys and 1 of these guys, and I'm done, right? Like, I want to be able to construct an encounter on the fly. That's, I think, really important to the way I run games, because I don't know where the players are going to be, and I don't want to have to pre-plan everything in the freaking universe just to be ready for what happens.
You don't want to have a stable of monsters sitting at the ready, who could possibly be available
in so many permutations that if somebody's missing or we have an extra player, that it won't, that I can adjust the encounters, right? Like, I used to write encounter tables so that I could know how many creatures of a given CR I could have for like this party minus 1 character, this party minus 2 characters, this party plus 2 or 1 character, just so that I could like actually try to coin some encounters on the fly, and it never really worked that well, because there's just too much to figure out.
Now, there are some good resources out there nowadays that make it a lot easier. So D&D Beyond, if you have an account on there, they've got some encounter builders there. Also Cobalt Fight Club. And there's some other resources out there as well that will help you pull together those encounters. But even then, that's still...
You still have to pre-plan the encounters.
Right. Yeah, you still have to have an idea of what you want to do and what you want to have available for your players. Right. And if you've got a very wayward group of players, that can make it very difficult. Or you always have to have your computer with you while you're gaming and just being like, okay, so I've just got this ready and I'm going to plug it in. And as soon as they get to something that I think they're going to encounter, I just roll real quick and figure out, through my resource what they're going to encounter.
Right. Which can end up with some weird consequences too of Kobold Fight Club, we're in the Underdark, and Kobold Fight Club gave us 4 demons and an Ankh-Egg. Mm-hmm. I mean, if your players are purely gamist and are treating it like a board game that's really cool, they're going to be like, okay. But if your players are even remotely narrativist, they'll be like, okay, wait.
Why?
The GM just said that there's an Ankh-Egg with the demons. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. Guys, there's a conspiracy to make Ankh-Eggs into the new demon horde. And then you'll be like, no, that's not, oh God.
And then you'll have to plan that conspiracy and have more Ankh-Eggs. It just snowballs.
Right. Okay, so it sounds like we've been ragging on a bunch about how we hate D&D. And we really, back to the what we said in the first episode on our D&D series here, we don't hate D&D.
No.
We've loved D&D for a long time, and we just, there are always flaws. I mean, that's why they keep making new editions. Mm-hmm. Well, that and because they think they can keep selling books, which they can. I've bought the books, so they earned their money, I guess. But we're not saying we hate D&D. We're not saying that it's a terrible game. We're just saying that in a lot of situations it might not be the right game. And we're specifically talking about ourselves right now, because we will be talking in the future about games that we do like and the pros and cons of those as well. Mm-hmm. And those discussions need to happen in the context of what we feel about D&D.
Yeah. And we will most likely be equally as harsh about some of those other systems because there are problems with some of the other systems that we like quite a lot.
Right.
Very similar, sort of thing, just different problems because of different
design.
Yeah, different design. So we have one more section to go with this. The next podcast is going to be about the social aspect of D&D and our concerns about that. But for now, I'm Liz.
And I'm Joe. This is Joe's Table signing off.
Bye, everyone.
See you next time. Peace.